Hi everybody. In this video I want to be talking about symbolism. We've got this essay, The Rake. You can see right under my video here kind of a picture we have of a rake. And one of the things to always keep in mind when you're reading, and then it's helpful of course when you're writing, is that when we've got something that's called, as we have here, the rake, right? Which is something which is pretty bland and generic, a rake. I mean, it's not like some big exciting thing that's going on, right? It's just this rake. It's just a garden tool. If we've got a title or something like that, then we should understand that what's happening is we're using that object as a symbol. And a symbol is going to be something that represents something else, something that stands in for something else. And when we're writing creatively, what we do is we create our own symbols, right? We decide, look, here's this object, which in the real world doesn't have any actual meaning. A rake doesn't have any meaning to us, right? It's just this object. But in the process of writing, we're going to say, how can I use that object as a symbol to help represent some of these other larger ideas? And in your discussion post we have for this assignment, excuse me, I'm going to ask you to talk about that. Why would he use the rake here? There's a lot of stuff going on. When you read this essay, you realize there's a lot of really terrible things going on in it. And why would we use something so basic? How is he going to use that to draw things together? And the reason that becomes important for us when we're writing is realize that you're surrounded by objects all the time, right? Those of you who are going to the poetry, the creative writing club meeting where you're going to work on poetry, that assignment that she's going to give there is going to have to do with just taking just everyday objects around us and talking about them in a way that makes them into something larger potentially. Again, that's something that we always want to think about doing. How is it that we are able to use these kind of basic objects to get some larger ideas across? And let's just start talking about how Mamet is doing this right at the very beginning of the essay. So look at what he says. He says, there was the incident of the rake and there was the incident of the school play, and it seems to me that they both took place at the round kitchen table. The table was not in the kitchen proper, but in an area called the nook, which held its claim to that small measure of charm by dint of a waist-high wall separating it from an adjacent area known as the living room. All the family meals were eaten at the nook. There was a dining room to the right, but as in most rooms of that name and at that time and in those surroundings, it was never used. The round table was of wrought iron and topped with glass. It was noteworthy for that glass, for it was more than once, and rather more than several times, I am inclined to think, that my stepfather down on the glass top, shattering it, and thus giving us to know how we had forced him out of control. And it seems that most times, when he would shatter the table, as often as that might have been, he would cut some portion of himself on the glass, and that he or his wife, our mother, would cut their hands on picking up the glass afterward, and that we children were to understand, and did understand, that these wounds were our fault. So the table was associated in our minds with the notion of blood. And just think about what he's doing here. He's taking a dining room table, right, which in the real world does have some kind of symbolic quality to it. That is, it's going to represent the family. It's where the family is going to get together and eat their meals. So it usually represents that. But by the time he gets through those first few paragraphs and he talks about how angry his stepfather is going to get, his father's going to cut his hand on the table, and then he says, so the table was associated in our minds with the notion of blood. And so he takes this symbol, which is supposed to be very pleasant on some level, and he makes it his own. He turns it into a very different symbol. He says, in my house, the dining room table was associated with blood. And so that's just one example of how he's beginning to create that symbol and get us to be able to think about this in a way that we're not necessarily used to. And that's something that we want to be doing. We want to be figuring out how is it that we can use objects to be able to help our readers understand these larger ideas, to feel like they're there and to understand them at a greater level. And that's something that he's doing. So we can see how he's doing it with the with the dining room table. And as you read through, look at how he might be using other symbols throughout the story, and then think about how specifically he is going to use the rake as a symbol. Because again, somebody might have said, well, why don't you call this story, your essay, the dining room table? Why not call it that? That's a lot of symbolic value in there. We think about the dining room table as being a place where family gets together, but then in his telling, it becomes something that is dangerous and about blood. But he decides to choose something that, again, is much more bland. And it's maybe much more surprising that he's able to get some kind of symbolic value out of that. So again, I want you, for your discussion session, to be thinking about how specifically he is going to use that rake to tie together some of these ideas, and then be thinking yourself about how you might be able to use objects to be able to help you tell your stories.